Hello and welcome to your lecture on World War I. Grab your student notes and use them to follow along and fill in any blanks that you missed in class. World War I raged from 1914 to 1918. It was known as the Great War, the war to end all wars, because of the number of countries involved and the sheer number of people who died. In all, 32 countries on 6 continents, every continent except for Antarctica, participated. And there were an estimated 40 million military and civilian casualties, 15 to 19 million of whom perished. World War I was fought between the Allied powers on one side and the Central Powers on the other. The Allied powers were led by our old friend, the Triple Entente, Britain, France, and Russia. The Central Powers, on the other hand, only had 2 members of the Triple Alliance, Germany and Austria-Hungary, because Italy had decided to stay neutral. Germany and Austria-Hungary were joined by a third country, however, the Ottoman Empire. So remember the Allied powers, Britain, France, and Russia on this side, and the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire on this side. Now, of course, with 32 countries involved in the war, many more countries than just those 6 were members of either the Allied powers or the Central Powers. But for the purposes of this class, please remember Britain, France, and Russia on the Allied powers side, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire on the Central Powers side. The Allied powers had a lot of advantages going into the war. They had more people, that means bigger armies, and more resources. But the Central Powers were not to be outdone. They had better technology and better discipline in their armies. The German army in particular was known for their exceptional training and discipline, and that's really, really important in an army. Soldiers need to know how to listen, they need to know what to do, where to go, and they need to be willing to work as a team and obey orders. German soldiers did all of that. So you have the Allied powers with their people and their resources, and the Central Powers with their technology and their great disciplined armies. All in all, a pretty even match. In Europe, most of the fighting occurred along 2 fronts, or battle lines. It's no surprise that there would be 2 fronts in Europe during World War I. After all, if you remember your map, the Central Powers occupy that swath down the middle of Europe, and the Allied powers are sort of sprinkled around the outside. It makes great strategic sense for the Allied powers to come at the Central Powers from 2 different angles. Come from Russia, come from Britain, France, and try and squeeze the Central Powers, force them to divide their armies and essentially fight 2 wars at once. This is exactly what happened. You have the Eastern Front, which is along the Russian border. If you look at your map, it's that Russian border along the edge of Germany and Austria-Hungary. And then you have the Western Front between Germany and France. And the actual line of the Western Front is more along the border of Belgium and France because Germany invaded Belgium to get to France. So you have the Eastern Front along the Russian border and the Western Front between Germany and France. Although a lot of the fighting did take place in Europe, fighting also took place around the world in the colonies. And that makes sense too, doesn't it? After all, when these European powers took colonies all over the world, they were extending their influence into these areas in Africa and Asia. And so it makes sense that the fighting in Europe would be mirrored by fighting in the colonies as German and French colonies, for example, tussled and fought. The world was becoming a battleground, and the rules were changing. Do you remember how in the Civil War, generals had to change tactics because new guns meant that old-style charges weren't nearly as effective? Well, the same thing is happening in World War I, only on a much grander scale. New technology changes the way that war is waged. Machine guns and artillery force war to become defensive. Think about it. If you charge an army across a battleground right toward an opponent armed with machine guns and artillery, what is going to happen? You will get slaughtered. You will be mown down like grass. So fighting in World War I goes to the trenches. Trenches are long, narrow ditches fortified with barbed wire and guns where soldiers lived and hid from artillery. The conditions in the trenches were miserable. Toilets would overflow. It's not like they had indoor plumbing, right? Toilets would be overflowing. The dirt of the bottom of the trenches would get muddy, maybe mixed with that raw sewage. There were lice. There were rats everywhere that would eat your food and crawl over you as you slept. And your days, when not terrifying because you were shooting or being shot at, were interminably boring because when push came to shove, you were spending all day in a ditch. Being in a trench was better than being out on the land between the trenches, however. The area of land between trenches was called no man's land, and it was a perilous place to be. Of course, armies immediately start brainstorming ways to kill people in trenches or to force them out of the trenches. So you have new weapons like poison gas and tanks designed to kill people in the trenches. Not all new technology used in the war was centered around trenches and killing people in them, however. You also have new modes of communication. Remember the telegraph and the wireless telegraph? Well, they have their day to shine in World War I because telegraphs and wireless telegraphs enable great communication between the land and the sea and air. You have wireless telegraphs in trenches and on submarines. Telegraphs enable countries to communicate with each other. Just think of all the possibilities. Well, one possibility that people quickly became aware of was that the enemy would be listening in on those radio waves from your wireless telegraphs and figuring out exactly what you were going to do and taking moves to prevent you from doing it. Wireless communication was easily intercepted, and battles were won or lost depending on the enemy's ability to read your transmissions and your ability to figure out what messages your enemy was sending. It became apparent very quickly that codes were needed. And so you have people developing ways to encipher messages so that the enemy can't read them. And you have a tussle between cryptanalysts and cryptographers on both sides as they try to crack each other's codes and create new codes that the other side won't be able to break. Airplanes and airships were also very important in World War II. Even though they'd only been invented a few years before, in 1903, you have your first military aircraft in 1909, and by the time World War I rolls around in 1914, they're ready to take to the skies. At first, airplanes and airships were mostly used for reconnaissance, for spying, for figuring out what the enemy was doing. However, it wasn't long before they were also being used to drop bombs and to fight enemy planes. In the beginning, both the Allied powers and the Central powers hoped, believed that the war would be a short one. It soon became apparent, however, that World War I was becoming a war of attrition. A war of attrition is a war where each side tries to win by wearing the other down. The first side to run out of soldiers and supplies loses. You've already seen this to some extent in the Civil War, where one of the reasons why the Confederacy lost was that it was running out of soldiers and important supplies like ammunition, clothing, and food. This happens in World War I too, but as with everything else, it happens on a much grander scale. Part of this is because both sides were so evenly matched. But part of it was also simply the nature of trench warfare, because in trench warfare, you have battles with enormous casualties, hundreds of thousands of people dying, and yet the battle lines hardly move at all. At the end of the day, very little ground is either gained or lost. Blockades also contributed. A blockade is an attempt to cut off travel, communications, and/or supplies to a country. If you look between Britain and Germany, you'll see a body of water called the North Sea. And the North Sea is where German ships left to go and trade with other countries and get important supplies. Is it any surprise then the British Navy looked at the North Sea and said, hey, that looks like a great place to set up a blockade. So Britain sent off her warships over to Germany to create a blockade to prevent Germany from getting important food and supplies into her country. Well, Germany looked at that British blockade and said, hey, two can play that game, Britain. And so Germany set up her own blockade around Great Britain using submarines, the famous and infamous German U-boats. All of a sudden, just as Germany isn't able to get in food and supplies very well, Britain is also blocked from getting important food and supplies. Just as people in the trenches are trying to wear each other out and make the other side run out of soldiers quicker, so in the same way, British and German blockades are basically trying to starve out each other's countries and prevent them from getting important supplies. By 1917, the world is worn out. Britain and Germany are the main countries left, and they both are desperate. They both know that if they're going to win this war, they're going to have to do it soon. That's all for today. I'll see you next week for the conclusion of World War I.